Ladies and gentlemen, welcome again to another episode of College Football Pros. I am your host, as always, Nick Valinchak, joined by Drew Van Jur. Drew, how are you doing this sunny, bright Ohio summertime afternoon?
I'm doing fantastic. It's hot and humid. It's summer in Ohio, and I love it. It's almost football season. It's all I know. It's a day closer.
It is a day closer, and it's been really an interesting several days here. Once the practices get started, unfortunately, you start to see guys going down left and right. So why don't we take some time to talk about that today? I mean, in the past, 28 to 48 hours, we've seen Jonathan Williams from Arkansas go down. That's probably the biggest one in the past couple of days. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, besides Tyner going down to Oregon, which of course happened, more
news.
Right,
Old
exactly.
News.
But I mean, and the sheer fact of impact player, that Jonathan Williams going down is huge for that team. Obviously, Brett Bielema is going to have another running back to put right in. But my question to you is, with Alex Collins, does he become the feature back, or does Alex Collins, still share that load with whoever running back 3 might be?
I don't know, but you know who I'm going to ask?
Who are you going to ask?
I'm going to ask Phil Steele because he's going to be joining us on the show in just a little bit. But if I had to take a guess myself, I would say that there is going to be an increased production for Collins. I just don't know if it takes him from that middle tier and pushes him that far up. The team, they know what they do there. Can you think back and remember when they were running? Let me see if I could get. I remember Hillis, right? Was it?
Yeah, Peyton Hillis and Darren McFadden.
But there was a third too, wasn't there?
Yeah, I don't remember.
And he was a pro. He was.
All three of them made the league. And if anybody out there remembers, please correct us, because sometimes we have a habit of going off of what we researched, and this happens.
Yeah. So I mean, I think the point I was getting at, whether how long the coach has been there or not, that's kind of what the team does. They like to run the football. I think that that somebody else, and I do think it will be like a one-person situation, will kind of step up to take the reins and to kind of assist Alex Collins. That's just my gut feeling. I know in the fantasy realm of things, it's not necessarily as cut and dry in the NFL, because you don't run into too many situations like this in the NFL. If Marshawn Lynch gets injured, you pretty much know who the replacement is going to be. And we're talking about a unique situation where it's a 1A that got injured. It wasn't a 1, it was a 1A. So I think that the expectations for Alex Collins to kind of take on that whole offensive production himself is a little bit blown out of proportion. I think he'll see an increase. I don't know what that increase is, but I think someone will step up alongside of him. What do you think?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, this is going back to what you said about, in the NFL, who the backup is. In college, you have a situation like Arkansas where you have Collins and Williams. Well, if Williams goes down, or when, obviously, he did go down, there's a third string back, obviously. But, that coach, Bielema, whoever it might be, can run him out there. And if he doesn't like what he's doing, I'm talking from a fantasy perspective. So if you take that running back number 3, and he comes out there not producing, there might be a freshman, sophomore, whatever it might be, waiting in the wings, and he comes in there and he explodes, and now he's the number 1. So unlike the NFL, like you were saying, to illustrate that point, it's a lot harder in college to say, okay, let's just go with the number 3 guy. Well, that's not always the case.
Very true. Another injury, much, much less severe, but it's in a major program that needs to be mentioned, is Alabama quarterback Jake Coker has to miss 7 to 10 days with a foot injury. I think this is interesting because I feel like Coker was the best situation they've been in terms of transition to a quarterback. I'm not saying he is uber, high-end talented. I'm just saying, they're not putting a redshirt freshman who may need some more time to develop. They're going to put Coker out there that's kind of jumped around enough and has enough experience, I think, that it wasn't going to be as big of a loss moving on from quarterbacks as it could have been, things like this kind of start out minor. I look at Kevin White in the NFL, and he was sitting out camp because he had a minor foot injury. And then, yesterday they're talking about, well, he might miss the whole year now because this is a hairline fracture. And, this is how those things start. So is this something that gives you concern, or do you think it's just likely to be exactly what it is?
Oh, I mean, I have serious concern about it. I mean, his backup right now is redshirt freshman David Cornwell. So I don't have a lot of faith that, a redshirt freshman could step in there and take, Nick Saban's playbook. I hope he does, because in the next week and a half to 2 weeks, he's going to be the guy running with the ones. So this is a situation where, just like the Kevin White in the NFL, what if he re-aggravates it during the season? What if the first snap of their first game, he re-aggravates it? Foot injuries, ankle injuries, knee injuries, man. Anytime a coach says he's going to miss any time more than like a day or two, I get worried, because first he says 7 to 10 days. Well, we will reevaluate him in 10 days. Well, on the 11th day, we're going to give him another week. Now you're into the season. So it's cause for concern if you're an Alabama fan.
Especially with a foot injury, because, I mean, that's where your pressure point is when you're walking. So, like, obviously the first day you're not going to, get up and try to walk around and move around. But even when you're first coming off of crutches, like, you get off the crutches sooner than you should, and that could be doctor directed. The doctor might say, it looks like you're fine, and you might get off and that pain's still there. I don't know. Just like you said, I have a great level of concern when I see things like that. And that's Alabama, the front runner this year for one of the playoff spots, the SEC champion. This is not the way you want to start your season.
No, absolutely not. And another injury that we just want to touch on real fast. Offensive lineman from the University of Washington, career was cut short because of injuries and stuff. So he was a 3-year starter. So that's you lose an offensive lineman that was going to start. That's never a good thing.
Definitely not, and especially because I think, someone else retired or took a hiatus at Washington this year, and that was Siler Miles, if I'm not mistaken, their starting quarterback. So the last thing you want to do is lose a tackle and your starting quarterback, and it already looked like more of the emphasis was going to be put on Dwayne Washington at the running back position. Now more that now the emphasis is still going to be there, and he's not going to have one of the talented people that were, making holes for him. So it's definitely cause for concern.
Right. One more bit of news that we can throw out there is that Kentucky has named Patrick Tolles their starting quarterback. That's, not breaking news, but in a program like Kentucky, I think this is the right decision.
I think it was expected. I'm not entirely sure who was there to give him that much of a run for his money. I do think it's going to be a situation, though, where he's going to have to show improvement, or else they may start looking towards next year. If things go poorly for a team early on and they feel like, all is lost, especially in a difficult conference like the SEC, they might start to look towards some of their younger players and say, okay, let's see what this guy can do, because obviously what we have isn't working right now.
Right, and one more injury. I'm just reading the headlines here. Georgia senior receiver Justin Scott Wesley had to leave practice after hurting his right knee. So, we don't know how severe that is. Hopefully it's not bad. But, a guy who tore his ACL a couple years ago, not good.
Definitely not. And on the receiver end of things, I also saw that Mike Lee Harris from the University of Akron as well is out for the season with a torn ACL, and he was one of their main components on that offense. It was an offense that has really struggled over the last couple of years, so it's undoubtedly not something that you want to have to see. You hate seeing this stuff happen in camp. You don't want, a prime example, and it just happens to be an example that ended up working out best for them, but look at Braxton Miller last year.
Right.
It can deflate a team's fan base before the season has even started.
Right. Yeah. I hate to see injuries. I really do. But we all know that it happens in, every game. And when you start camps like this, like everybody's in full swing, injuries happen, and it just sucks to talk about.
Yeah, there's no question about it. And, another starting quarterback news, Nick Stevens was mentioned. He was made starter of the Colorado State Rams yesterday. So now we know who's going to be throwing the ball to Rashard Higgins. The main question there still for me is, I think Garrett Grayson was a high enough talent that his NFL career looks like it could be promising. I mean, obviously he's going to start out as a backup. He doesn't come in with the fanfare of a Mariota or a Jameis Winston. Nick Stevens, having the leading receiver in the nation returning with him, definitely has all the talent in the world around him between that and Cartwright. So it'll be interesting to see how he's able to develop as the year goes along. I'm much more tepid on Higgins than you are. I know that for you, he still represents the top class of receivers. I'm going to give you a name that I have this weird feeling about, and he could be, at the end of the year, one of the top receivers, if not the top, but I do have to stress that a lot will have to go right.
Johnny Dixon.
For it to happen. Absolutely not. He's not even going to be the top receiver on his team, most likely. So, in all honesty, and we'll be talking about this conference over the next couple of days, is I really like Kevon Lucas's shot at having a strong year. He had a good year last year. He was 1,300 yards and I think a dozen touchdowns. And that was in an offense that really didn't reach its full potential whatsoever. They're going to be returning the quarterback, returning the other components on the offense to kind of open things up for Lucas. So I think if everything goes right, and believe me, when we talk about the Tulsa program, you'll see how everything needs to go right by what happened last year. But I think he could be that guy that kind of ends up near the top of things. I don't know. We'll talk about that, at a later date. Just wanted to throw that out there. The excitement is in the air, though, Drew. We're 16, 17, 15 days, somewhere around that. Kickoff is going to happen September 3rd. It's really exciting. I just dropped my Wednesday class because it was going to interfere for like 4 weeks of watching 4 games. That's nice. My dedication to college football.
Love
I'm not going to let my education interfere with this podcast and my hobbies, but it's really exciting. And, we're starting to see now how things are coming together. Auburn had released its Week 2 preseason depth charts, and I was just going through it a little bit to try to see, if there was any nuggets of knowledge I could gain from it, specifically at the running back position, having to replace so much from last year with Cameron Artis-Payne gone. And, right now their running back situation is just a bunch of oars.
Yeah, early in the preseason, early in the fall camps, you have a lot of oars for receivers, linemen, quarterbacks, even. So yeah, I mean, in the next 7 to 10 days, you're going to start to see a lot of those oars drop away, and that's when the real excitement starts, because the season's right around the corner.
Well, it has to happen because you don't. I think it's a mistake from a team to go in the year without having certainty and confidence. If you're looking at your running back position and still saying, I don't know what we should do, I know that people like to, idealize situations and say, well, that's a great thing, but it's really not. You know what I mean? You have to give someone on that team the power and, the confidence to say, hey, you are our guy at this position. This position starts and ends with you, so go out there and show me that I didn't make a bad decision by putting you out there.
Yeah, absolutely, and especially I think especially at the running back position, you don't want that guy looking over his shoulder every time he, has a negative play, or every time he maybe drops the ball. Maybe not fumbles, because that's a different story, but you'll want to have the guy, and if you're Arkansas or a team that runs multiple running backs or even receivers, doesn't matter the position, you want to have the guy out there in full confidence and not have to look over his shoulder.
A couple of days ago on our Twitter at CFB Pros, I shared a statistic that I thought was pretty interesting, and I for one try to take statistics with a grain of salt, especially when I hear it since 2005. Honestly, that's not that long ago.
Right.
You know what I mean? If you say since 1960, I'm going to be like, oh, for real? That's a little bit different. But when you say like since 2004, and especially worse, I see it all the time with baseball. They'll be like, this is the first time this player has done this since 2014. So 1 year.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
They haven't hit 3 home runs in a game in a year? You're kidding me.
Right.
But yeah, this is very interesting because there's so many implications that go along with it, and that is first year Michigan coaches are 11-2-1 against Ohio State the first time they play them.
Yeah, I saw that. I don't really hold that into anything because everybody has different schemes, everybody has different players, and yada yada yada. So I don't know. I don't know how much weight I put into that.
I like the narrative.
Oh, yeah.
I think that, it's the last game of the year short of the conference championship should Ohio State. We don't want to cash their check already.
No, of course not.
We've done that. People have done that one way or the other so many times in years past, and it just never works out properly.
Not at all.
But I think ultimately it adds some intrigue to that game when we get to it at the end of the year. It already has a storied history. It's definitely one of the most storied in all of college football. And anything that you could add on top of it, just having Harbaugh there the first year, Ohio State double-digit favorites in all their games, the consensus number one, it just seems like that perfect storm for something to go wrong would be that game because it doesn't make sense. So it would make sense because it doesn't make sense for that game to somehow end up poorly.
Right. I mean, like we said, you never know. What's the old adage? You never say never. But at the same time, I just don't. I mean, you bring in Harbaugh, who runs a completely different system than Brady Hoke, and then you have Urban Meyer's Ohio State team, who is as dominant. So again, you never say never, but wow.
All right, folks. Well, we are excited today to have a guest with us. He is one of the biggest influencers of the dissemination of information in college football. He is the Tower of Power, too sweet to be sour, the cat's pajamas, the bee's knees, and the godfather of college football. Did I leave anything out?
I think that pretty much covers it, and I'm taking it that you've also been a boxing announcer in the past.
Not a boxing announcer. I have been involved with the wrestling industry, the professional wrestling industry, so every now and then, specifically on every podcast, it ends up bleeding out a little bit. But Phil Steele, how are you doing this wonderful afternoon?
Hey, real good. How about yourself?
Well, I'm excited. We're just about 2 weeks away from college football, and my favorite part is that all the talk can stop. We're left to our own devices for 8 months to just talk about what we think is going to happen, and I can't wait for it to actually start to transpire on the field.
Yeah, it's definitely, it's what I do 365 days of the year is college football, and it's always a lot more fun when the games are actually being played. And when the teams are in camp like they are right now, you know that's just about to happen.
Yeah, so speaking of camp, there was one specific individual that had a lot of excitement around their entry into Oregon this year who finally last week was able to gain entry to their program. I don't think I've ever been so excited that somebody passed a math test in my life. I certainly didn't care that much when I was in high school and even in college for that matter. How important is this transfer of Vernon Adams to Oregon? I mean, they're losing Mariota. They have Jeff Locke. He didn't necessarily look that impressive in the brief moments he spelled Mariota. Is it that cut and dry of a battle that Vernon Adams is likely to be the guy there?
Vernon Adams is the likely starter at Oregon, but the one thing I'm going to say is a lot of folks are expecting him to come in and be like Russell Wilson was at Wisconsin. Remember, Russell Wilson came in, actually got to Wisconsin to the best season ever, coming in as a transfer from NC State. But the difference is definitely boiling down to the amount of time spent with the team prior. I'm going to look at Russell Wilson. He not only came in over the summertime at Wisconsin, he earned to be the captain of the team in 1 month. That's how much he was working out with the team. Now, Vernon Adams, as you mentioned, just got cleared. In fact, he's not going to be able to practice for another couple of days yet because you have to wait 4 days once you get cleared and put in. And he's going to have to beat out Jeff Locke. Locke's been playing well in the spring. He had a fantastic spring game. Lockheed's been working with the team over the summer. He's earned the trust of his teammates. So that's going to be a very interesting battle. And interesting in the fact that Oregon's second game of the season is at Michigan State. So they're going to have a first-time starting quarterback at Michigan State. Is it going to be Vernon Adams? Is it going to be Jeff Locke? And how much will they have the system down pat? Locke would have the system down pat, but he's not as experienced as Vernon Adams is. Vernon Adams had a great career at Eastern Washington, did well against Pac-12 competition, and probably not as mobile. And that's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out.
It's funny that you mentioned the Russell Wilson transfer. I just saw an article about that today, and I didn't think it was that fair of a comparison. I mean, Russell Wilson was taking a step up in competition, but Vernon Adams is taking a leap up in competition. So I think it's not quite night and day, but I think the deck is certainly stacked against Adams more than Wilson. Keeping with that Oregon theme, last week they lost Thomas Tyner to an injury. It looks like he'll be out the whole season. How does that affect the use in the backfield? And do you think there'll be more Byron Marshall after he kind of split out wide last year coming from the backfield?
You know, the possibility clearly exists. You look at the fact that Thomas Tyner was the guy that in the postseason last year was actually the leading rusher. He had 186 yards of rushing in the postseason. But Royce Freeman was the starter coming in, figured to be the starter. They also brought in Taj Griffin. Now, Griffin's a 5'10", 175-pound true frosh that was in for the spring. He's very versatile. They say he's has a little of Michael James in him. So he's a guy that was a little limited in the spring. He was rehabbing from his ACL, but has 4.31 speed, a 45-inch vertical. He's a guy to watch. But I do agree, when you look at this receiving core, they have so many receivers, and that's a big difference from what they had for the championship game last year. Remember, for the championship game, they were missing the majority of the receivers. Now they've got all those injured guys back. Byron Marshall, if they had to, would be a perfect fit to slide back into the running back position. So they're still very deep at the skilled players.
I'm going to tend to agree with you, and Drew and I did talk about this actually on one of our previous podcasts with the fact that they were, the story going into the championship game was a narrative about how Ohio State had dealt with the adversity of their injured quarterbacks throughout the year, but Oregon was depleted of some talent, including, like you said, a lot of their receivers. Ifo Ekpe-Olumu was out, and it definitely put them at a disadvantage. Now, I'll say that I don't think the outcome of the game necessarily would have been much different, but at the same time, they were dealing with their fair share of shortcomings. I think the biggest running back situation that we just kind of saw transpire over the last few days was Jonathan Williams at Arkansas going down under Bielema. That offense is Bielema. It's kind of been this run heavy, pound it forward mentality. What is the expectation there with Williams gone? Do you think it's going to be a full-on increase for Alex Collins, or do you think that there's somebody kind of waiting in the wings to take take Jonathan Williams' production?
Yeah, it's pretty much like it was at Wisconsin for Coach Bielema. He's got plenty of talent waiting in the wings. Now, I will say this. With Jonathan Williams and Alex Collins, a couple of similar style backs, both guys around 220 pounds. You had an easy transformation. Put one out, put the other in, keep them fresh. You got fresh legs in the fourth quarter. You have a dynamic running back. With the loss of Williams, they're still going to be dynamic at the position with Collins, but they also have Cody Walker. Now, Cody Walker is 6'2", 240. When I talked to Bielema this spring, he mentioned that here's a guy that had a chance to rush for 1,000 yards this year. He's granted his sixth year, so he's got another year left in him. And he's really a complete back. He can do it all. He added some speed and quickness to go along with his 240 pounds. They've got Raleigh Williams. Now, Raleigh Williams is a guy who's 205 pounds. He's a true freshman, just came in. Bielema actually compared him to Monty Ball. So that's a pretty high comparison. He's a big physical guy, So now they've got a little bit more physicality at the running back position waiting in the wings. Denzel Evans is a guy that is the number 4 guy, and if he gets on the field, they're probably in trouble. So while I'm not as concerned with the production from the starters for Arkansas, I am concerned if another injury pops up, because right now they're in good shape with Alex Collins, Cody Walker, and Raleigh Williams. But if another guy goes down, they really need to have 2 to 3 running backs here in the Arkansas offense, and they would be limited. So as long as no other injuries pop up, then I don't think the Jonathan Williams injury has a major impact at all. But should another one crop up, especially to Alex Collins, then all of a sudden this position goes from being one of the best in the country to one where it's just a little above average.
Yeah, the injuries are definitely a major concern, and especially with those tough SEC defenses. So sticking with that theme, do you think there's a scenario that exists where these SEC teams can beat up on each other enough that it could lead to their exclusion from the college football playoff this year? I mean, SEC is kind of the media darling in terms of conferences out there, and whether that is earned or not is not necessarily the case, but they continue to turn out top talent teams. Their players get drafted consistently high in the NFL and have good careers. So do you think there's a scenario that exists in reality where the SEC could beat up on itself so badly that they're just not going to be in the playoffs this year?
I believe the possibility does exist. For me to not see an SEC team in the playoffs would be pretty shocking coming in. But when I look at the teams, and look at the team I picked to win the SEC this year, for example, it's Alabama. Now, Alabama's a team that probably has the best defense. Well, I think they will have the best defense in the country at the end of the year. My number 1 rated defense line, number 3 set of linebackers, number 7 DBs. But it's an Alabama team that also plays the toughest schedule in the country. Not only do they play each of the teams from the SEC West, and there are 7 legitimate top 25 caliber teams in the SEC West, but they also draw the top 2 teams out of the East, in Georgia and Tennessee. They also pull Wisconsin out of the Big Ten West, the team I picked to win the West this year. So it's really the toughest schedule in the country. Besides those, they're taking on a team like Middle Tennessee State, which I think will be in a bowl game. So you're talking about a lot of bowl teams, a lot of tough games on a week-to-week basis. Their road games are against Auburn, Mississippi State, Georgia, and Texas A&M. Wisconsin's at a neutral site. It's a brutal schedule. Now, if Alabama comes out of there with 2 losses, which is a distinct possibility, then you have to wonder, would they get in over a conference with 1 win? And at the moment, I think the possibility exists. Can I see the SEC out of the playoffs? It'd be tough, but I would think the possibility would be in about the 20% range right now.
Yeah, I find the whole SEC interesting. I mean, there's a number of teams. On the one side, you're right, you have Alabama, but you also have Auburn. A&M is in there. There's a lot of discussion to be had on that side. I personally don't know why. I keep looking at Texas A&M, and I don't know how serious they can compete this year, but I think that they could play spoiler for some of these teams. The coaches poll was just released, I think 2 weeks ago now, and it consisted of a top 4 of 2 Big 12 teams. Now, I think we kind of understand that this is just a coaches poll, and it's supposed to be reflecting the strength of the teams coming into the year. I don't personally believe that there is a way that TCU and Baylor can both get in. If one of them couldn't get in last year, I don't see a scenario where 2 of them could get in this year. Even outside of the Big 12, do you think there's a realistic shot that 2 teams from the same conference will get into the playoffs in year 2?
Once again, you're talking about a 20% or less situation because of the fact that you basically have 5 conference commissioners that all want in. And if one of them gets left out, that's major. Now, if 2 of them get left out, you got a lot of screaming going on during the off season. So odds are you end up with 4 conference championships in the playoffs. But should we go to the alternative? And let's say there's a lot of 2-loss teams out there. And let's say one of the 2-loss conferences is the Pac-12 and the ACC. And then I'm going to give you the conference that I feel has the best chance of actually landing 2 teams in the playoffs this year. And it's a shocker because last year, 4 weeks into the season, this was a conference that was generally regarded as the weakest of the 5 Power 5 conferences. It was one that was judged as a conference that had no chance of even making the playoffs last year, and that's the Big Ten. In the Big Ten, they had lost all their conference or non-conference games, at least the majority of the big ones. Ohio State had a loss. Michigan State had a loss. All the big boys had losses, even Wisconsin. And the fact that even making the playoffs seemed like a long shot at the time. But now let's fast forward here. The Big Ten did well in the bowls, earned some national respect. And then the two teams I'm going to hone in on are Ohio State and Michigan State. I think Ohio State's the best team in the country. They're a double-digit favorite in every single game they've played this year. They should be able to make the national championship game. But let's look at Michigan State. Michigan State's got my number 1 rated offensive line, number 2 rated defensive line, a veteran senior quarterback in Connor Cook. Their toughest game besides Ohio State is Oregon. And they get Oregon at home week 2. And Oregon still doesn't know who their quarterback is right now. I think Michigan State wins that game. So if the Pac-12 champ is, let's say, Oregon, they get their act together at the end of the year, they win the Pac-12 title, they've got 2 losses this year, and one of them's to Michigan State. There is no way you could take an Oregon and put them in over a Michigan State, so they would have that advantage. Then if the ACC has 2 losses, all of a sudden Michigan State's a 1-loss team with their lone loss. Let's say it's a field goal loss in Columbus. And that was in a hostile setting. Now you get them a neutral site. It's an even game. I think Michigan State would have that possibility. Chances of it happening? Probably less than 20%. But if one conference is going to get 2 teams into the playoffs this year, I feel it's going to be the Big Ten.
That's not as surprising as you would think. In fact, most of the people that we've talked to who have gone outside of the, Ohio State, TCU, Alabama, filter in Oregon, USC as the other 4s, Michigan State has been named a lot, and I'm going to agree with you. I think that's a very interesting situation. I was looking through all of the conference schedules and trying to compile end of the year win-loss records just based off of how I felt the game would go if there were no extenuating circumstances. And I had to pause on that Ohio State Michigan State for quite a while, and for 29 out of 30 minutes I had Michigan State, but at the 30th minute I had to move back to Ohio State. I just don't see where Ohio State gets stopped before the postseason. Keeping in the Big Ten, and kind of an interesting statistic that I just saw while reading a magazine the other day, is that Michigan is 11-2-1 against Ohio State under first-year coaches. Now, I don't know what level those Ohio State teams were at the time. It's tough to imagine that they were at the caliber of the team that we'll be seeing in 2015. But when you see statistics like that, does that cause you to turn your head at all? I know that there's some other ones that the SEC hasn't had a repeat champion since, I think, 2004, 2005. Whoever comes in the coaches poll at number 1 hasn't been there at the end of the year since 2004. When you see things like that, does that cause you to bat an eye, or do you just look at those kind of statistics as peripheral and not really that important?
For the most part, a lot of them are peripheral, but in the Ohio State case, I've actually used this as an example many times this radio season. And you don't sound like you'd be old enough to remember exactly the situation, Nicholas, but I'm going to go back to 1968. And in 1968, this year, first of all, let's say what they're saying about this year's Ohio State. Last year's team was the Super Softs. They got there a year early. Nobody expected them to win the national title. They did. Now that they've won the national title with all those sophomores and have the bulk of the team coming back, they should be able to win the next national championship for sure. Way back in 1968, not much was expected of Ohio State. They were coming off a mediocre season. They inserted a bunch of sophomores into the lineup. They had Rex Kern, John Brockington, Jim Otis. And they were dominant, pretty much, as everyone would expect. They were the number 1 team coming in. They blew opponents out on a weekly basis. And then they get to the final game of the season, and it's at Michigan, of all places. Now, the previous year, they beat Michigan something like 50-13. And at the end of the game, Woody Hayes went for 2 in that game. And they asked him why he went for 2, and he said, because they couldn't go for 3, basically rubbing in the faces of Michigan. Well, that year, Michigan had a first-year head coach. It was Bo Schembechler. And Ohio State was a big favorite, beat Michigan. They go to the Rose Bowl. They are going to win the national championship a second straight year. And what happens? Michigan just outplayed them start to finish at home under the first-year head coach. It did help that Bo knew Woody inside and out because he was an assistant at Ohio State. But I've drawn that parallel numerous times this offseason, and the fact that you think that the Super Softs coming off a win last year are the slam dunks, but that final game of the season is against Michigan and a first-year head coach.
I think so often in college football, more than a lot of other sports, that the team with the better talent doesn't always win. I look at the Ohio State team last year, and I'm not discounting it. I think they were a very, very strong team. I don't know if I feel like they were better overall than Alabama or Oregon, but the fact of the matter is they played like they wanted it more, and at the end of the day, that kind of translates to the gap in talent between the two teams, I feel. And I think that could be where this situation could come in. I think Michigan and Harbaugh probably have a ton of motivation to want to spoil, the repeat for Ohio State. So it's certainly a possibility. Kind of looking outside of the Power 5 conferences, outside of Boise State, do you see any other group of 5 teams that could really make some noise this year?
I don't see any of the group of 5 teams that are going to go undefeated this season. I think each one picks up a loss somewhere. And really, if you're talking about getting into the playoff atmosphere, then I don't think any of them really deserve to be. I mean, you look no further than the fact that the Pac-12 plays 9 conference games. So that's 9 FBS opponents on a weekly basis, basically playing FBS opponents. Meanwhile, the non-Power 5 teams are generally playing just a couple of Power 5 teams during the course of the year. Boise State comes in as my number 1 team, but they've got 2 very tough road games. They got to play BYU and Virginia, both on the road this year. That's going to be making it pretty tough to run the table. But, if you're looking for what team has got a shot, how about Marshall? Marshall could run the table, but no way do they get in the playoff mix because they're going to run the table because they play the number 128th toughest schedule in the country. So really, when I look at the Power 5 teams, I don't know if we're going to see any of them come out unbeaten this year.
Is it time to just kind of say that there's no way a non-Power 5 team is going to make it to the playoff? Is it time to maybe, kind of split them into 2? And I don't know if you do something for the group of 5 teams, but it just seems highly unrealistic that, any of these non-Power 5 teams are going to make it.
This year I think it comes down to the fact that I don't see a dominant non-Power 5 team. I could make a case where in the future a non-Power 5 team could indeed make the playoffs. Let's say there's a great team out there that basically has everybody back. They blow opponents out on a weekly basis 50-10. They set up 3 Power 5 teams. 2 of them turn out to be pretty good teams in the non-conference slate. They beat them and beat them handily. They have a Heisman Trophy contender, a quarterback, a star players throughout the lineup. I think a team like that could sneak in, especially if teams winning the conferences all have 1 loss, or some of them even have 2 losses. So I'm not ready to say yet that they can't get there, but if a proposal like Nick Saban says, hey, let's just give all the Power 5 teams play Power 5 teams and not have non-conference games against a group of 5, then in that case, the door would be shut.
I think a good place to finish up for me, coming from the Youngstown area, would be to look at the FCS. And this year, you came out with a digital version of the FCS preview. Good read. You can find that on philsteele.com and order it through there. Is it the North Dakota State show again this year? Do we have any relevant competition that could keep them on their toes?
No, the good thing about the FCS, they play so many games. When you get to the end of the season, you do have to maintain good health. Sometimes the best teams don't always win it, but it has been quite a run for North Dakota State. They have been powering through the schedule. And, last year in the championship game, they were taking on Trey Roberson, who's an Indiana quarterback. He led Illinois State there. I've got Illinois State a contender once again. Teams like South Dakota State, Sam Houston State, Coastal Carolina, all have chances of being towards the top. Actually, my number 2 team is Villanova this year. When you look at Villanova, their 2 regular season losses last year were both by 1 point. They've got 7 starters back. They got a Walter Payton Award winner and John Robertson. Last year he had 65% with 34 touchdowns, there's 3 interceptions. So they're a team that's in the mix. Illinois State's in the mix. But, I'm leaning with North Dakota State, and really they're a team that you almost have to pick until they actually lose. They just continually win each and every year, and even the championship game last year, competitive in the second quarter, end up pulling away and winning it. So I went with North Dakota State to get it. And you mentioned the FCS magazine. You can actually go to the website right now, which is philsteele.com. That's STEELE.com. And when you go there, you can order the magazine and download it to your computer. So it gives you a nice, if you have a good-sized computer, you can read the pages pretty easily.
Yeah, I bought it over the weekend and have been looking at it, and, I go to Youngstown State University. Right now, I have their game against Pitt as my upset of the year. With Tyler Boyd being injured, that does put a lot of the emphasis onto James Conner. I'm not saying that Youngstown State team is at the level of Pitt, but they love playing spoiler.
Yeah, and a lot of times what happens, and I talk to probably 75-80% of the coaches out there, and what happens in those FCS games is the coach can talk till he's blue in the face and tell the team that, these are legitimate players, you got to get ready for the game, and the players just take it lightly. And the FCS guys are just fired up. Here's their chance to prove that they belong. They can play with the big boys. So it's one of those where definitely the incentive is with the FCS team completely, and what's looked at as a breather by the FBS team sometimes turns out to be a surprise.
Yeah, there's a lot of history there, too. Both Pelini and Narduzzi grew up in this area. I believe Narduzzi played for his father at YSU. I could be wrong, but I think I'm correct on that. And they both played for rival high schools. So there's a lot of a narrative that's kind of not going to be talked about just because it's an FCS school. But it's going to be a very fun game for the people in this area. Phil, I thank you very much for coming on today. We sure appreciate your time. Is there anything you want to tell our guests, where to find you, where to order your magazines?
Yeah, I appreciate that. The magazine, the College Football Preview magazine, is out there right now. It's at Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, Walgreens, Target, CVS, and Publix. This time of year it is sold out in a lot of places, but I just went to a Books A Million, and they had some on hand, so I think you'll be able to find it. Now, if it is sold out, you can go to the website, which is philsteele.com, order it there, or call our offices direct at 866-918-7711. That's 866-918-7711. And if you order it today, we'll go ahead and ship it out today. You can download it to your iPad or iPhone through iTunes, or your Android device through Google Play. And you can also, we have an NFL magazine, which is available on both iPhone and iPad, or the Android devices through Google Play and iTunes. You can order the NFL magazine through the offices, and in Ohio, you can get the NFL magazine at any Drug Mart location, and that's got 4 full pages on each and every team. Now, the FCS magazine out there, and you talk about being from Youngstown, I put a lot of work and effort into the FCS magazine this year. It's over 200 pages. We need to sell more than 500-600 of these things, or it's not worth it. I end up losing a ton of money, and it's not worth producing an FCS magazine. I'm actually willing to print one next year if we get enough people purchasing it. There you just go to philsteele.com. You can click on the logo right on the front page, order it, download it to your computer, and maybe we'll get a printed version of the FCS next year if we can sell enough of these.
Well, I hope so, because the FBS magazine is infinitely helpful when you have everybody from ESPN to CBS to every other sports network there is out there telling you that they couldn't do their job without your magazine. You know you're doing something right. So, Phil, we thank you again. We hope to have you on the show again.
All right, sounds good. A lot of fun talking football with you today, Nicholas.
All right, take it easy. Well, we reached the end of yet another exciting podcast, and if anybody wants to talk about with what they heard in this episode, where can they find you, Drew?
They can always find me on Twitter at CFBProsDrew, and where can they find you, Nick?
They could find me on Twitter at CFBPros, on Facebook at College Football Pros, and online at www.cfbpros.com. We will see you next time.